Welcome to episode 51 of the School Transportation Nation podcast. I'm Tony Corpin, publisher of STN, and this podcast episode is brought to you by TransFinder, the leader in school bus routing software, and our tech tip is brought to you by Zonar, a leader in smart fleet management.
I'm Ryan Gray, editor-in-chief of School Transportation News. Our guest a little bit later today will be Kelly Shahan, manager of transportation for Red Clay Consolidated Schools in Wilmington, Delaware.
Excellent. Looking forward to that conversation. Ryan, want to kick off the conversation here. AASA has got their Superintendent of the Year awards coming up in just a couple of days here, February 18th and 19th. Ryan, you want to fill us in? Who are the finalists that are up for consideration for the great prestige of the Superintendent of the Year award?
Yeah, the award will be given on February 18th, and the four finalists are Brian Johnson, the superintendent of Hamilton County Schools in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We know that school district very well from the 2016 crash. Brian Johnson actually became the superintendent the following year. The other finalists are Khalid Mumin, I hope I'm saying that correctly, from Reading School District in Reading, Pennsylvania. Christy Perry, Salem Kaiser Public Schools in Salem, Oregon. We know that school district very well. And Michelle Reed from North Shore School District in Bothell, Washington.
Wonderful. We'll be excited to see who is given the prestigious crown of Superintendent of the Year. Usually they're featured on the cover of our April edition, but everything's virtual this year. So I think we're putting together an article online for our readers to catch up on. Everybody keep a lookout on the STN website for interviews with the finalists. Really interesting stuff there. And Ryan, we have some interesting stuff going on in the news with CDC. They have been extremely active over the last couple of weeks, giving more information on, school reopening. We've got the Biden administration commenting. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, well, President Joe Biden has now said he wants all the schools back in-person classes 5 days a week. That came a little bit after a White House spokesperson said at least 1 day a week, and that caused some rankling of feathers out there. So they clarified that their goal is to get in-person classes back to 5 days a week. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, it seems like we've been getting guidance from them weekly. So the latest guidance released on Friday looks at operational strategy necessary to get K-12 schools to reopen and to stay open. Basically, nothing a lot that's new here. They're pointing to really three main objectives: consistent implementation of layered mitigation strategies to reduce transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in schools. Of course, looking at wearing masks, washing your hands, doing the physical distancing. Indicators of community transmission to reflect level of community risk. Been talking about that for a long time, looking at what the local health departments are extrapolating from emergency room visits and hospital admittance regarding what that perfect sweet spot is, if you will, of the number of infections, and trying to keep that number low so they can reopen the economy, get schools back. And then phase mitigation and learning modes based on levels of community transmission. For transportation, there's not a lot here. It does mention it a few times, basically talking about engaging transportation staff along with the entire school community, as well as parents, to really have the proper ducks in the row to reopen schools or keep them open. Meanwhile, Dr. Anthony Fauci, we all know him now, household name. He's the director of the Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the National Institute there. He said that children as young as first graders could start getting vaccinated by September. He made comments to ProPublica last week in an article, and Pfizer is currently conducting a trial of 12 to 15-year-olds and could start a trial soon of 5 to 11-year-olds in, quote, the first half of 2021. So anytime between now and likely June or July.
That's interesting, Ryan. I mean, as a parent of two young children, I think it's, it'll be as common as the flu shot probably to get this vaccine. I'm not sure if it's a one-time gig or we're just going to have to get it every season, but I guess time will tell how it's all going to shake out. But it'll be interesting how kids react, because you hear of different reactions to the vaccine. And, some people in that first wave are now getting the second shot, and many people are waiting waiting and waiting to get their first shot. So I guess down the line as it goes. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. CDC, Ryan, they're talking masks, and I've seen a lot about maybe people doubling up their masks. What are the comments on those kind of subjects lately?
Yeah, so CDC published additional research last week that recommends that 2 masks rather than 1 is the best way to go to avoid catching the COVID-19 disease. And they also really make sure to point out that to make sure that these masks are fitted. I don't know about you, Tony, but we have some of these cloth masks, and sometimes they kind of, have some openings on the side. The research shows that sneezing, coughing, or just regular transmission of talking, if you're too close to someone, they could sneak out the sides there. So you can read an article at stnonline.com about this. Our associate editor, Taylor Hannon, dove into this topic last week. So you can read more on what they're talking about. He has some nice pictures, too, to kind of illustrate what you should be looking for. And, the CDC research just keeps coming. Last October, they conducted an observational research of 13 to 21-year-olds. So 21-year-olds, obviously expanding that to cover children that are protected under IDEA. And they were asked them the percentage of their peers who they observed to be wearing their masks all the time. And it shouldn't be surprised that a lot of the kids were seeing fairly good mask usage in classrooms and in class hallways, 65%, I think, in the classrooms, about 60 or 62% in hallways. But they also asked, what about outside on school property? And certainly school buses could apply to that school property only about 30% of the time. So that comes back into what we talked about last week with additional CDC guidance and really an order on mandatory mask wearing in public transportation. And that includes both private and public school buses. So that is really focused on ridership, right? It's an enforcement campaign to an extent, but it's really more of an educational outreach of just really hammering home the point that the best way to mitigate this spread of this virus is to wear your masks. Speaking of which, a news item caught my eye this past week, millions of N95 masks. So those super duper masks that block out 95% of all of the stuff in the air, that has really been, focused on getting those to emergency workers, doctors. But there's a lot of first responders. School bus obviously falls under that 1B category by CDC. So some of you all might out there have some N95 masks. Well, U.S. Homeland Security and Border Control and Protection, they did an investigation and they uncovered some fraud. It shouldn't surprise you. There's always some nefarious folks out there looking to profit on a pandemic. Masks sold in 5 states, including Washington State and Minnesota. These N95 masks were found to be counterfeit. They had the 3M label, but they were not 3M. They were not made in the U.S., and it looks like some of them were made in Latin America and were being brought over and actually sold to these states. Just a word of warning out there, just like anything, just be diligent, be trying to do your best to ensure that what you're ordering is what you're actually getting and what you think you're getting. Meanwhile, you mentioned, Tony, back to the vaccine, and I had mentioned it earlier, with children maybe by this summer or early fall getting the vaccine. CDC, once again in the news, they came out and said, if those who are fully vaccinated, and some folks are now, have already gotten their 2 shots, they don't need to immediately quarantine if they become exposed to COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That is, if 2 weeks have elapsed since that second shot to build full or near full immunity. But CDC added that it's unknown how long this vaccine protection lasts. So the best we can do is just keep on keeping on, do your research, be smart out there, wear your masks, and be safe.
Yeah, Ryan, there's so much happening right now. Another headline caught my eye that I wanted to throw out. I was watching a video. There's a really cool project called Project Hazel. There's a company called Razor, and they made a smart mask, right? So it has like a UV light in the mask. There's all these really interesting things. But if you're interested, check out Project Hazel. Very interesting technology, kind of a futuristic mask. You never know what could happen with schools or kids wanting something cool or different that's fitted. But there's a lot happening, a lot of changes in school transportation these days. And the tech tip today is brought to you by Zonar, a leader in smart fleet management. Wireless carriers are sunsetting 3G networks. If your fleet is still 3G dependent, you risk growing service disruptions. Eventually, you'll lose service once your carrier hits the final off switch. Beat the rush and move to 4G. Work with a trusted telematics provider like Zonar to upgrade to 4G seamlessly and keep your operations moving without missing a beat. Visit zonarsystems.com/3G sunset. That's zonarsystems.com/3G sunset. All right, Ryan, shifting gears, let's talk about the money, the dollars. There's been a lot of talk about this $1.9 trillion proposal. When is it coming out? Will it pass? Lots of action on that. You want to give us a quick update?
Yeah, so House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said last week that legislation should pass by March, which is concurrent with when unemployment programs are set to expire. So obviously a big push right there. You know, we still have pretty bad unemployment, at least 6.5%, and that's not including those who have just given up. So we still have, over 1 million of these folks that are claiming unemployment. We don't want that relief to run out. So that seems to be the timeline for that 1.9 trillion. And of course, 130 billion is set aside for K through 12 schools. So further relief on that angle. Now, what's not going to be a part of this 1.9 trillion bill is a federal minimum wage hike. But a North Carolina school district, we learned, proactively raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour. That would be Durham Public Schools. A lot of districts have already superseded that $15 mark, but there are a lot of districts that are still underneath that for at least their introductory wage. We are actually surveying readers right now, so be on the lookout in your email for that. We'll be reporting some of those findings this spring. But one of the opposition points to, including minimum wage, first of all, in the COVID-19 relief bill, is they just didn't really find that was appropriate right now. Now, certainly there is a lot of support out there behind increasing the minimum wage, that whole aspect of creating that living wage for people. But the opposition really points out, and Jody Ernst from Iowa brought up this amendment to really squash this in the 1.9 trillion proposal, that, it's not appropriate for a one-size-fits-all approach. Certainly, as I mentioned, pandemic, this could hurt business further. Also, too, there's some concern that, why try to have wages match between perhaps, say, Chicago and Arkansas? Cost of living's different. So that was a big reason for that being set aside. But look for that to be taken up later this year. So the federal minimum wage hike is not going away. It's just not going to be a part of this latest CARES Act 3, if you want to call it that. But meanwhile, talk about show me the money. So the school bus contractors, as we all know, have really taken it on the chin, probably worse than anybody in the school bus industry since COVID-19 first fell upon us. They did get $2 billion in CERTS Act money last year. They share this money with motor coach, over-the-road bus, and passenger vessels. But this coalition had asked for $8 billion originally. They only got $2 billion. So this coalition has gone back to Congress, and they are now requesting an additional $40 billion, probably hoping that with the Democrats controlling both the Senate and the House, that they might get a little bit more leeway on that. But a lot of this, none of this $2 billion, in fact, has really started flowing yet. So we did see the coalition reach out to some senators, and some senators, a bipartisan group, actually took that up. So they have requested to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to go ahead and release that $2 billion. Interestingly enough, with this request for the additional $40 billion, NSTA pointed out, they're a member of this coalition, the National School Transportation Association, that school bus contractors, private school bus companies, lost $4 billion in revenue last year, and they're projected to lose another $3.75 billion this year. So, even more reason for some help.
That's interesting, Ryan. I know a lot of school districts are in the throes of budgeting right now, and everybody's trying to figure out what do I need? What am I going to get? You got to be the squeaky wheel, right? You have to advocate with your superintendent, your school board, your CFO. You got to be at the table, right? Fighting for dollars to be able to make sure school transportation has a seat at the table, that you're involved in the discussions on how COVID-19 funding gets distributed, right? This is a lot of money. The $130 billion is no small amount. I mean, I think I've talked to a few people about it. It's got to be the single largest federal distribution of money in terms of the single shot in the arm that I think I can ever remember, period. So we really think that this could be a big game changer for our industry and helping school transportation. Hopefully it's, not a steal from Peter to pay Paul situation where you're going to transportation and asked to make deeper cuts. Hopefully, you're going to get back maybe something you lost, or at least be shored up. So you're going to be able to do more with less as usual. That's what we're always asked to do, right? So I think in the end, it's going to be a good thing having this funding, but you got to advocate for the solutions. If that's contact tracing, if that's cleaning solutions, if that's using tech, if that's routing, if that's seating charts, whatever that is, there are so many things that you can do. And it's a major, major headache that you're probably feeling, right? You're tense these days. Your department is all twisted up over driver shortages, that taking attendance, hybrid routes. Tense might actually be an understatement, but our friends at TransFinder feel your pain, and they have therapy for your transportation department needs, routing therapy. Forget about taking 2 aspirin and calling the doctor in the morning. Get 3 amazing TransFinder solutions and get rid of the headache altogether. There's the award-winning Route Finder Plus, the Wayfinder driver app, and the all-in-one Stop Finder parent app. Say goodbye to your headache and rest easy knowing TransFinder's got this. Call 800-373-3609 or email marketing@transfinder.com to learn more. And another thing I just want to remind you guys of is we have our Transportation Director Summit coming up March 29th through the 30th. If you're a transportation director, you'll love transportation, you'll love leadership. It's free to you. You have to apply at tdsummit.com. We've got some amazing leadership speakers, a great schedule. We have over 100 registrants already qualified. Don't wait. There's only so many seats available. Again, go tdsummit.com. We'd love to see you there. And also, if you like green, clean energy, we've got the Green Bus Summit, which is greenbussummit.com. That is April 20th, 21st, and 22nd. We'll be updating the website with more information in the coming weeks. Keep an eye out for the registration there. It is free also to you. So you have lots of opportunities to get really great training from School Transportation News. We're super excited for that. Next up, I've got Ryan speaking with Kelly Shahan from Red Clay Consolidated Schools. Looking forward to that conversation.
Welcome, School Transportation Nation. Kelly Shahan, Manager of Transportation for Red Clay Consolidated Schools in Wilmington, Delaware. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly.
You are very welcome, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So a little bit of a challenging year, to say the least. Almost a year now since COVID descended upon us. Tell us how it's affected Red Clay and what your operations look like right now compared to a year ago.
Well, you're absolutely correct. It's certainly unprecedented, the things that we've been going through. The biggest thing that I can tell you is we've learned so much about the heart and integrity of the people that work in the transportation department. They are definitely on the front line. We're out there driving the students to and from school. We were out there delivering food to our families, just as many transportation departments across the country have been doing. So one of the biggest learnings for us is we're in it to win it for our districts and for our communities. And we're certainly a part of the team. And we're letting everybody know how important the bus drivers are for the whole school districts.
And some of you may have caught Kelly a couple weeks ago. She was a speaker during our STN Expo Virtual and talked about technology's role that has been being played in Red Clay and in terms of, determining ridership. Kelly, you guys have been a big consumer of technology even before COVID, right? Tell us how you've leveraged technology and perhaps maybe some new business case models that you've implemented or perhaps just new ways of using technology since COVID.
We've been super lucky in our district because we jumped on the technology bandwagon far before COVID hit, and that only put us in a better position going into COVID and helping us to able to do things like get accurate ridership data, planning for smaller size routes, contact tracing, and things like that. And, I was listening to Tony earlier before I jumped on the call, and he mentioned about having a voice at the leadership table. And that should be like exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. The transportation manager, supervisor, director must be recognized and have a part at the district's leadership table so that we can be heard and get funding for technology like GPS, like rugged tablets, like Where's the Bus apps, barcode readers, cameras on our buses, and things like that. So we can get that as part of the planning with everything that the school districts plan for, Chromebooks for kids, smart boards for teachers, and technology on the school buses. And one of the biggest problems that we've experienced in this industry is that we always haven't been considered like equal to all of those needs and concerns. And I think with COVID, that's really starting to show folks that, hey, oh my gosh, we got to step up and start including transportation in a lot of these discussions so we can get them ready. So the next time this hits, we're going to be prepared with having the right technology on the buses so we can get the information and data we need to keep our students safer and still get them to school.
Speaking of stepping up, I imagine like most of your peers across the nation, you are knee deep or maybe chin deep in budget crunching and looking toward the next school year. You mentioned it, getting funding, right? Any anticipation for you right now on how COVID is affecting state funding, local revenue, local funding that might be available to you? Is it something that perhaps, and you can say if you've used CARES Act funds so far for some of your technology, your PPE or your cleaning, but is there any concern right now that because there's been so much federal money available to schools and trickling down to transportation, that it might affect funding from the state or local sources going forward?
So we have used some of the CARES Act money, and, it has to be spread out equally, looking at all the needs of the entire district and going through this COVID. Everybody has a need in every part of the district. But I'm fortunate to live in the great state of Delaware. And we have a very generous state when it comes to, trying to take care of our communities and our students. And it trickles down to the bus drivers. And we did not have to, lay off or furlough any of our drivers or our bus aides or our staff in the transportation office. They recognized that we need to keep funding the routes and keep our contractors funded and our homeless contractors funded so that we could be ready to go with staffing and availability, once all this kind of lightens up a little bit and we can start taking more than 23 students on a 72 passenger bus to school.
Okay. And how does Delaware fund you guys? Because I know there's, 50 different states essentially do almost 50 different things. Is it something where they are funding you by mileage, by students, kind of a combination of both? How does your normal funding matriculate?
So I will say that the contracts that are funded for bus routes through the state of Delaware, it's extremely complicated. And our transportation supervisor for the state, Tyler Bryan, is a master of all of the behind the scenes, numbers and things like that. But it is funded by mileage, but there's a piece in there for driver salary, aide salary, numbers of years of service. There's a piece in the formula for administration. There's some piece of local and state funding built in depending on the different levels of jobs. It's extremely complicated, but the contracts are based on mileage for the most part.
Okay, great. And then being in a cold weather state, I don't know what the temperature was for you this morning when you woke up, probably pre-dawn. But imagine here in mid-February, it was pretty chilly. A lot of talk lately has been around ventilation systems because the CDC, going back to last spring and summer, talking about trying to mitigate COVID was, hey, school buses should operate with their windows down. Okay, maybe that works in August, September, October even, but January, February, even some places in March. What does that look like for Red Clay? Are you guys looking at ventilation systems? Do you have ventilation systems?
So we do not have ventilation systems. That was part of discussion early on at our state supervisor meetings with our state transportation department. They're quite expensive. And, early on when we were having those discussions, we were kind of weighing the cost versus, to outfit an entire fleet all at once would be very expensive. And one of the great things that we've done with technology in Red Clay in the past is we've started small and kind of built up to it. Like we're putting, just for example, cameras, stop arm cameras in all of our buses, and we're not outfitting the whole fleet because it would be very expensive. So the same with the ventilation systems. It would be quite expensive to outfit the entire fleet. And, I don't know that we all really know that much about what the benefits would be versus the cost, right now. I don't think that, we know enough about it. I don't think we have a lot of data from other fleets that have them and kind of are seeing, doing testing and air quality testing and things like that. So I don't see that for Red Clay in the near future. If our state went to it, we probably would, trickle in and jump in. But right now it's quite expensive.
So how many buses in total are you operating?
So we have about 142 on contract, made up of district and contractors, with about 100 of those being district buses, fleet buses out of our office, our location.
There's certainly that complicates when you have a mixed fleet like that. For Kelly and for all of our listeners, we will be covering ventilation more in depth in our March issue. So just a couple weeks away, look out for that. Some districts that have been using it for several months now, and some, to your point, Kelly, some information on how that is working. So stay tuned for that. Also want to talk about driver vaccines. So there's been a lot of talk about that, Kelly. A lot of districts seem to be kind of on the sidelines still. They're not going to be requiring it. We kind of hear some differing things coming from the federal government on, you should get vaccinated. And then CDC said a couple of weeks ago, well, actually, teachers and other support staff don't need to get vaccinated necessarily for safe reopening. Still, there's a lot of talk about that. And, school bus drivers being that 1B essential worker delineation from the CDC. Where do you guys stand on having your drivers vaccinated?
Well, getting any vaccine is a personal decision, and each person kind of has to look at their situation medically and mentally and decide, what's right for them. But our district is currently following all the recommended guidelines and making the vaccine available to our drivers and aides and other district employees as required. Like you mentioned, we're currently in the 1B category, and everyone in our district is in like a random pool. And I think we're making it available to about 1,200 educators, which includes all the operations folks. So that would be nutrition and custodians and bus drivers and bus aides. So we're making it available to about 1,200 educators each week. However, it is not mandatory at this time.
Okay, good to hear. And then to close, want to come back to this topic of driver shortage. We were talking earlier and you were mentioning that it's affecting everybody. You said that you have been lucky enough to be able to keep your school bus drivers employed throughout this whole, mess. But what's your driver shortage issue look like going forward, especially as you're looking toward next year? Is this something that you feel are going to be short drivers? You've been dealing with it, obviously. It sounds like everybody. What has the district been doing for outreach and to communicate to would-be applicants that this is what they need to be doing?
So in Delaware, the shortage is real. We have all been living it, long before COVID hit. And now that COVID's here, people are leaving to go work other jobs, especially contractors aren't part of the state. So they're not staying funded like we have been fortunate to have stayed funded, like I mentioned earlier. One thing that we did in Red Clay prior to COVID, which put us in such a great position with the driver shortage, was we used all of our technology to plan and get accurate ridership data and to kind of tighten up our routes and eliminate contractor buses. I mean, we eliminated probably 70 contractor buses prior to COVID just using the technology, which then freed up a lot of drivers for us and put us in a really great position going into this pandemic. We had 100% fully staffed drivers. And right now we are still in that position in Red Clay. I mean, it's every day it's up and down. Like you lose a driver, you gain a driver. But right now we're in a pretty good shape, but it's all because the district believed in us and believed that we were a part of that team, as Tony said earlier, and invested in us so that we had the tools to make our department everything that it can be and keep it that way.
And because your contractors haven't been getting paid, any concerns going forward about being able to bring them back in and have them be available?
Well, some of the contractors are getting paid if they're on a district contract, if they're a state vendor. So like my 42 contractors, their contracts are being funded, provided they pass that money along to their drivers. But a lot of the contracts for other non-state transportation deals are not being funded, and those drivers are leaving. And it does provide an opportunity for them to come over to the districts, or, they can get unemployment, I guess, or Amazon is really growing in our area. And so a lot of people are leaving the school bus industry and going to work for Amazon because they're popping up big warehouses all over Delaware.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everyone is in the virtual mode, and certainly those businesses have not been hurting too much, but definitely a new element of competition that school districts have to deal with. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing what's going on there in Red Clay. And again, really appreciate you making the time.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I'd love to be back anytime. Proud to be part of the Transportation Nation, and I'm super excited to sign up for the Transportation Director Summit.
Awesome. See you there.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Hey, special thanks to Kelly and Ryan for being with us today on the podcast. Special thank you to our sponsors, TransFinder and Zonar. We appreciate you guys. Thank you for listening. Email us at info@stnmedia.com with all your questions and comments. We'd love hearing from you. You have things you want us to talk about? We want to hear from you. What are the challenges you're facing, School Transportation Nation? Let's talk about it on the podcast. You want to be a guest on the podcast? Hey, email us there too. We'd love to talk to you. Remember, you can visit stnonline.com for more news, stories, and information. Also, we got all that good COVID-19 coverage, lots of great stories, breaking information. Don't miss it at stnonline.com. Again, subscribe, stream, review, and share this podcast with all your friends on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or STN Podcasts, or frankly, wherever you listen to podcasts. We're everywhere. We love you, School Transportation Nation. We'll see you next week.